Stephen, Nick, thank you so much for chatting with me about your work on the visual effects of The Last of Us. Since we got two of you here, I'd love to just kind of start and tell me about your role on the show and what sorts of elements that you really highlighted in your work. Stephen, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I was the one of the visual effects supervisors for DNEG's work on The Last of Us. So I was working on, I think we worked on 7 of the 9 episodes, and then Nick here picked up the last episode. Your turn, Nick. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was the DFX soup, so Stephen's right-hand man for the first 7 episodes, and then first 6 of the 7 that we contributed to, and then for the final episode jumped into the visual effects supervisor role for that one to finish up.
Yeah, and then in terms of our work, we were primarily working on a lot of the iconic environments that the game is known for, and the series is known for now. We did do a variety of work, effects work, but yeah, our kind of most complex work took place in Boston, QZ, Kansas City, and then Salt Lake and Jackson Hole. Yeah, so yeah, quite a few of the cities through the entire show.
Yeah, for sure. You like you said, there's so many iconic elements of the game. How familiar were you with the game itself prior to joining the project?
Yeah, I think I can say for a lot of us that worked on the show that many of us were big fans of the series already, and kind of just in awe of the work that Naughty Dog has done. And yeah, we always use that as our foundation for concept work. And anytime we were looking for inspiration, we would often just go to the game and that concept work. And we have our concept books here, and yeah, we just always go to those for just inspiration.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think for speaking for myself, I was maybe one of the exceptions. I had not played the games coming into this project, so I was very familiar with them. Being from an environments background myself, they've obviously they've stood the test of time from a sort of design and visual standpoint. So I was very familiar with the concept art and the sort of visual style of the project from seeing it over the years. But it took actually moving on to this show to give me the sort of nudge that I needed to go away and actually play the games fully from start to finish.
That's awesome. I feel like that's a plus though, right? To have some people deeply familiar and like love the material, and then some people who are more removed and don't necessarily have the same reverence, or the same like history with the game, right? Did that kind of aid you in any way?
I mean, I think that there is some it helps to be able to cut through the nostalgia that some people might have for the games when you're looking at it completely fresh. And from my point of view, it's certainly I've had worse homework over the years than going away and playing 2 Last of Us games.
Yeah. Did you play the games during work hours, Nick, or?
No comment.
Hold on. You guys can have that conversation offline.
Yeah.
So how early on were you guys brought onto the project?
I suppose it was pretty early, but it was kind of as production was ramping up. It's just as far as I can remember, Nick. Yeah, they started to feel out for studios that could be involved pretty early on. So
yeah,
I know Alex Wong, the VFX supervisor for HBO. He reached out to Nick and I. He's worked with both of us before, and he knew that I come from a compositing background, like integration and all that, and Nick comes from an environment background. So as a pair, it kind of was perfect for the type of work that he was looking to place at our company DNEG, which is just a lot of the environment work, and a lot of it has to be blended into the plate. So quite complex compositing work there.
Yeah, let's talk about those environments. Let's talk about the vis effects work itself. So, the visual effects are blended so well. The environments are blended so well into the live action footage. It's hard. It's certainly hard for someone like me to tell the difference. How are the on location shoots prepped to help you guys make your exceptional work?
Yeah, so the on-set dressing and what they managed, the production design managed, is pretty incredible, and it gave us a pretty good foundation for our work. Certainly, we obviously had to match the games to some extent, but the games are somewhat stylized compared to reality, so I think that always helps us to have that foundation to build into onto the onset. A lot of times, they would have like 20 cars dressed with like moss and rust and all the stuff, like just incredible detail. And then there would be a layer of cars, 100 cars on the road that were still actually there, but maybe just weren't dressed. Or I think even maybe they used the extras parking as or the crew parking like as a part of the set, just to look like like an abandoned highway. And then so, we would have to enhance that work and then extend beyond that with more cars and detail. But it's just like it kind of gives you like some ground rules and some kind of, you have to stay honest to the plates when they have that much work put into them. And yeah, we also like, a lot of the vegetation that we developed had to match into the dressing that they were doing on set, which was a mix of, real ivy or whatever they could get at that time of year. Oftentimes, like, because they shot over a full year, oftentimes it was limited in what they could get that looked green. So yeah, matching into that with our CG. So yeah, it keeps you honest. The more you can kind of build into the foundations of what's on the set. And that really comes down to, they worked really hard and they thought and planned quite considerably to make sure that, there was something thought out that we could integrate into it. It wasn't just blue boxes put up, good luck in post. It was quite a lot of consideration put into it, which, helps us down the line.
Yeah. And, coming from having spent some time out on the sets early on the project as well, it was, you could see the kind of care and attention that was going into that dressing. There were some things that, even with the best of planning, you just can't account for, one of which is obviously the weather, and the production got just the worst luck with the weather, due to some delays on the early parts of the shoot. Stuff that was supposed to be kind of shot towards the end of summer ended up being more into the kind of autumn, fall period. So losing leaves on trees that we would have to sort of take note of and think, okay, we may have to repair some of that later on. And then just little things, the practicalities of trying to build so much out on location meant that there was a lot of reuse of set dressing, and so the set deck teams would typically run in pretty quickly after a shoot would wrap in one location to try and repurpose elements for another location, which meant that our time to get in and photograph things, capture 3D LiDAR scans and things like that could be limited. And in some cases, the set deck team were so keen to get everything right, and they would actually go in between takes as well and just move a few bits of dressing around just to capture something a bit better. So we had to take copious amounts of notes and make sure that we were going to account for that later when we got all of these data sets back in post to work with.
That's great. I was going to ask about that. Maybe you can tell me more about that, Nick. First of all, did you both visit set in person, or just you, Nick?
We both did at different times. So for me, it was with the main unit earlier on to do some initial kind of scouting with Alex, and then to be around for the main unit shoot to take a bunch of notes and make sure that we were planning for our photography, which we did both at that time, and then also in some cases just revisited those locations on the main sets in Calgary and Edmonton. But then Stephen accompanied the team from within DNEG to go out and shoot some Splinter VFX stuff that was specific to the work that we were doing in Boston itself. So we obviously had to marry those two locations. So we each kind of tackled one component there.
That's great. It's awesome. Yeah, I would definitely wanted to talk about the detail that's in these environments. I mean, it is just so, there's the vegetation that's coming through, debris strewn about. What sort of references, in addition to the things that you captured on set, what sort of references were you able to use to inform building out such detailed work?
Yeah, I'll take this. Yeah, so we had a wide variety. So of course, like creatively, we would have the concept work from the games to use as inspiration. When it came to like finding reference in reality, for building destruction, it was often like looking at construction and collapses and that kind of thing. We did a substantial amount of the bomb city and building collapses and that kind of thing, and just looking at how just how the weight of buildings and the amount of volume within those buildings works. It's really important for Alex to just feel the weight and the scale of these buildings, so that they didn't just feel like just a chunk was bitten out of the side of it. The floors had to sag over time just from the weathering, and all of that detail. So, there's not too much detail of bomb cities exactly when they're intact. So it's just like from a huge variety of whatever you can find of construction or things like that. Weathering photos and reference. We did actually go out with the environment team, even in our local environment, and look at around the city of Vancouver, and just you don't have to go too far to find like 20-year-old buildings that haven't been cleaned. Like, I think everyone can find that in their local city. And you just take inspiration from that. We just tons of photography. Where does moss grow? Where does the water get to? And so you'd always take these things into account when we've got damage and destruction in our cities. Where did the water pour into over 20 years, and where did it come out, and where did that cause vegetation to grow, and so on. And then for the vegetation, it was tough because like a lot of the Last of Us is known for its ivy covering buildings and all that kind of stuff. There's not too much of that. We found a lot of ivy references on like fancy hotels and that kind of thing, like abandoned theme parks in Japan. Like, I think anyone it works in visual effects knows these references, seen them before. Again, going into our local environment, you find just so much variety, and you can it's almost endless the amount of detail that you can add to nature. So it was really difficult, blend of the reality of it, and then taking things up a notch to really hit that kind of iconic Last of Us look, which is heavy greenery. To me, we were always thinking like, okay, like there was an office plant, 20 years it grew out this top of this building and created this massive tree growing outside of a side of a building. We tried our best to justify it however we could, but at the end of the day, it just had to look quite pretty.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most iconic shots already from the series is, I believe it's at the end of the first episode, when the trio is venturing out into the dark of the city at night. Lightning flashes kind of illuminating, and you get this first real glimpse of the bombed out city. That must have been an extremely challenging shot. Take me through the development of such an iconic shot, like replicating from the games. Dark light flashes. Tell me how you developed that.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to some of the early part of that development. It was particularly challenging because it was one of the first major shots that we had to take to pretty much a final stage, because it featured in an early trailer. So the pressure was definitely on that one. But it was one of the first shots that in fact, the very first shot, I believe, that we prevised for the client. So we had some idea of what we were in for. I mean, in terms of the steps that we took to achieve that, we put a lot of initial time into just planning, looking at the real Boston and just planning, where does our quarantine zone actually sit in this big city. We had to just factor in where that wall would actually cut through our real location, make sure that kind of fit with the sets that we had, which we all had LiDAR scans for. So we kind of went through an initial process of just extracting open source satellite data for the whole of Boston City, and then just trying to match some of our locations in there. We had some concept work that had been done by Alex's team early on. So we did have something to kind of guide those decisions, but then we just went through and said, okay, well, if this was really, if the main street of the quarantine zone is here, then the escape is really kind of this area. And that kind of matched up to North Street in Boston, which like a very specific location. So then we went and gathered as much reference as we could from North Street, both from just online sources, and then when we went and did our own shoot. And then that served as a basis for just constructing that whole environment. So we knew that we only had to see it from one vantage point very clearly over the course of one sequence, really, and all at night. So that was factored into our approach to the build. But it was we took some of the main buildings that are in the kind of immediate area off North Street and decided to build those as full CG assets. So we fully modeled, textured, and looked at those as hero assets. But we actually built them in their non-destroyed form, so as they would appear in the real Boston, until we felt like we'd got that location nailed down enough that we could then go in and start adding some of that kind of complexity and destruction. There's probably more to say about some of that kind of approach that we took to the destruction, but for that sequence in particular, one of the big things, as you said, is the lighting. So we really, it was one of those that became a bit of a labor of love. For me in particular, I really enjoyed sort of diving into the cinematography of how to nail a night shoot like that, because one of the biggest challenges we had is no natural light sources. I mean, we've got a big storm overhead. We know that because it's raining heavily and there's thunder and lightning going off. So we didn't have the normal justification of saying, hey, we could maybe expose for a moonlight. There was no lights in the city or any architectural lighting that we could use to kind of illuminate the scene. And none of the characters were carrying a light. So there was nothing really that we could use to sort of just ground ourselves and say, okay, that's what we're going to latch onto to light the shot. So we ended up just digging into a lot of cinematic references from some of the masters over the years. I think Conrad Hall ended up being one of the key cinematographers that we looked at the work on Road to Perdition and said, this is great. We can use this as a reference for kind of how light plays across wet streets and when there's rain kicking up and some of the mist catches, and just positioning kind of banks of lights in areas where they're not visible in the shot as a source, but they will just kind of create this really nice composition where we just get the lit street with the silhouettes of the characters reading against it. So that's kind of how we approached that one.
Yeah, I mean, it was beautiful. Beautiful shot. Really set up the series very well. You guys have referenced Alex Wang a few times. Tell me about working with him as a supervisor on this show, and what sort of direction you received throughout the process.
Yeah, so Alex was really wonderful to work with. He had to deal with thousands of shots on the show. So I was really impressed of how he could handle everything on this one. So Alex, his philosophy was really, just about looking at the non-visual effects work on the show and just making sure that we were grounding within that. If you watch the show, everything's from the character's perspective. There's very few times where we could really break away and go big. One of them is, like you mentioned, that last shot of episode 1. But it feels really earned at that point. And, the audience is sort of just completely invested at that point, and is not thinking about visual effects or anything like that. So I think it's always that. And, throughout the series, many times, we would work up a full CG shot and, we'd pick the perfect sky and, the perfect lighting. And he would just say, like, it's too perfect. Because, like Nick said, they're shooting over the course of a year in Calgary and Alberta. You show up on the day, you hope the lighting's good. Sometimes it's not. And taking that kind of like real world kind of variety into our CG work. So it's never perfect, and often it was just looking at a few shots in the cut and for non-visual effects work and just, using those as inspiration. So yeah, he was really good about kind of just reining us back a bit, keeping the focus on the characters. And that helped. And, I think it just helps the audience to just kind of believe in your work completely. There's still a lot to be proud of course, of all our work. But yeah, I think their philosophy massively benefited the audience believing in our work. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to know from each of you kind of two questions. What was your biggest individual challenge on the show? And what are you most proud of, whether it's a specific shot or a sequence or anything like that? What are you the biggest challenge and what are you most proud of? Stephen, why don't you start with you?
Okay. Boy, so I think biggest challenge, I think destruction work and vegetation work can be very difficult on their own. Combining them together and all the considerations there, it adds a lot of complexity and time. So yeah, I think that for me was absolutely the biggest challenge. So we had to figure out a bit of a process to, building out this world, using the destruction for composition, and then of course actually needing to build detail into this world, layers of interior furniture and exterior tiles on the buildings and glass and framework, so that we could have a believable destruction. Then we go in and add this incredible detail of set dressing to just add all this extra detail, interior flooring and furniture and stuff that just really adds like believability and variety. And then we would go in and add vegetation on top of that. So by the time you're starting vegetation, you've already gone through this pretty massive process of buy-off with Alex and Craig to get to this point where you can start adding vegetation. So quite a long process there. And yeah, so, and it's tough. Sometimes you have to be like, this isn't quite a complete picture, but when we add the vegetation, it's going to fill out these areas and, to kind of paint a picture of where we're taking that. And then, yeah, I think in terms of, was it favorite shot you were asking about?
Or what you're most proud of, whether
most
that's
proud
a shot
of?
or something else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm proud of a lot. I think one thing that always comes to mind is the sequence that's recreated from the game, which is when they exit the museum rooftop and they do the ladder crossing and look out over to the State House. And it really like traveling to Boston, capturing those worlds. We went onto rooftops, we hung out windows, rebuilt all that world, such beautiful destruction work and environment work and compositing work there. And I just love that sequence because it follows such an intense and claustrophobic sequence. They get out onto the rooftop and, it's incredibly dangerous. They're 6 stories up off the ground, but somehow you feel like there's this breath of fresh air. And you really have a moment to take in, the detail of the world that we've built. So yeah, I think it's special within the show. I love the kind of the context of where it lands. And yeah, just really proud of all the work done in that sequence.
That's good. It's a great shot.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Nick?
I think for me, I would say in terms of the challenge, it was probably the amount. If you look at the cuts, this show is really about this travel. It's following these guys on their journey. So you might normally expect that across as many sequences as we worked on that you would spend a little bit of time in some. But I think looking at the work that we did, we had big full CG builds to do of massive environments that we might only spend an average of 5 shots and then we move on again. So it was that constant kind of balance of how much do we build this, as if it's a full world that we need to explore versus how much do we try and treat it from a camera's point of view and just build exactly what we're going to see. And just there's so much data to manage when you're doing that. And at every step, we wanted to make sure we weren't repeating and reusing elements. I think there's always that kind of assumption that you can kit bash certain bits and pieces, reuse the same elements time and again. But we really wanted to try and stay true to the real locations, both the ones that we were matching to in Calgary and Edmonton and also to Boston. So we put a lot of time and effort into actually building them as they would exist in real life. I think it helps the design ultimately when you do that. You're not guessing or just throwing kind of random buildings in to fill up space and create a nice composition. You're actually working from something that's a bit more grounded and realistic. But it's a big challenge, managing that over so many sequences is a big challenge. So just the amount of data and the consistency that we managed to achieve, I think was a big challenge. But in terms of things I'm most proud of, it swings for me all the time. Every time I kind of look back at the work, there's the obvious big stuff that I'm really proud of because I do think that we provided some quite big full frame CG shots that held up really well. But then other times it's some of the little moments that you can take for granted. Things like there was our state house. We visit the state house. We don't see it too much from the exterior, but we see it from both sides of the building. And there was a point in the show where we realized that we were actually just replacing it with our CG state house, and it was not a big decision to have to make to do that. Our asset held up really, really well. The ivy growth on top looked great, and everything integrated perfectly. So little things like that, where we just suddenly made a decision to, let's just throw away the real state house and replace it with full CG, and for that not to be something that causes crisis meetings was great, as well as just things like, the overpass. We were replacing ivy that was just as close in the foreground as a lot of the set dress that was done. So to be able to do that and know that our CG was holding up to that level of scrutiny was really nice. They're not necessarily things that your average audience member is going to notice or recognize, but it's something I think we can be proud of.
Absolutely. The work is so impressive, and the show is as well. You talked about audience reactions, which for The Last of Us, of course, has been overwhelmingly positive. I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts on. I feel like more than any other aspect of filmmaking, visual effects, I feel like gets the most comments from just casual moviegoers, right? Like you never hear casual film goers talking about the cinematography or
Editing,
things like that,
yeah.
editing, right? But you'll hear about it if they say, "Oh, the CGI was bad," right? You'll hear about it every time. What do you wish more people knew before they criticized visual effects?
Tricky one. I think to some extent it's the constraints that you're under dictate some of the work that we do. There's various things that you have to achieve when you're telling a story that go beyond just the freeze frame that you're looking at on a YouTube trailer, and so some of those decisions are done with narrative in mind. Some are done with purely practical budgetary constraints in mind, and we have to work with all of that and sort of provide what we can to help tell the story in the best way. So I think that's not always something that's necessarily clear, especially because a lot of the time the people make their minds up on these early trailer releases and things, which are often unfinished versions of visual effects or some temp components included in there. So you hope that people will stay with it long enough to appreciate how the visual effects impacts the narrative and the storytelling once they see it play out in the full episode.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a challenge, and I think smart showrunners and filmmakers generally will consider this into their approach when they're making the visual effects. So, I think oftentimes, we're under all these constraints of visual effects, and sometimes you have shots where you just, no matter what you can do, you just can't make it feel right, and you're butting your head against the wall. And I think the really good filmmakers and showrunners and VFX supervisors like Craig Mazin and Alex Wang, they would say okay, let's find another option. Let's simplify things. Let's change our approach from the original plan to make sure that, this isn't the one shot that takes people out of the show. So I think I would I think the more we can kind of consider that, just the reality of, hey, we didn't shoot it quite right. Maybe we should change our approach and find different ways to make it work. So I think that was really nice about this show, is that they were always willing to have those conversations about, how we take the best path forward. And that's why the show is very consistent in that way. So if we came up challenges where we felt like we couldn't execute on something, we would find another way, or, look for inspiration elsewhere and take it in a different direction. So you don't often get that with our clients, but we're pretty fortunate to have it on Last of Us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And clearly it paid off with the incredible work. Well, before I let you go, I'd love to hear from each of you just how you got started in the industry. How did you get started with visual effects work and kind of make it to where you are now? Nick, why don't you start?
Sure, yeah. I came about it in a roundabout fashion. I kind of got into doing art during my teenage years, but was kind of into the graffiti scene and that sort of thing. It was just something that kind of interested me, but never really considered it as part of a career, but managed to start to do some representational art and managed to make enough money from just selling spray paintings and things, but landscape spray paintings, that I kind of started to get into that kind of thing. I dropped it for a little while. I was actually intending to go to law school, and it was kind of at the last minute, after I'd already done the hard work to try and get myself into law school, that I suddenly decided, maybe it's actually not the best path for me. And I'd gotten into watching movies like The Lord of the Rings and been sort of really inspired by the artistry that goes into that. And so I decided to pursue it. Ended up focusing very heavily on that, and actually took a visual effects degree, which is, I think, one of only 2 in the UK that was available at that time. So I knew what I wanted to do, and had a kind of leaning towards trying to get into matte painting, which I knew was a difficult career, and not many people were working in the UK at that point doing that role. But it really kind of interested me, so I just pushed hard to pursue that, and ignored the warning signs of how difficult it might be, and eventually landed a runner's gig at DNEG in London in 2009, and just on a 2-week temporary contract to cover someone's bereavement leave, and then they never got rid of me after that. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. Steven, same question. How'd you get started?
Yeah, so I guess when I think of like the starting point of when I was interested in visual effects is my high school had a media arts program, which kind of just let us do whatever our desires were in terms of animation or little dramas, or some people worked on the TV within the school. So it was quite good. It was just perfect, like just wherever your inspiration takes you. I go back to that as kind of the starting point of like, we made films and animations. And then I think we had a visitor from one of the local visual effects schools or art schools that came by, and they showed a demo reel. It was just like, a CG car like integrated into a parking lot. And I was like, oh my God, like this is amazing. Shaky camera, like the car is integrated. In like 2003, I was like, we've kind of been playing with 3D programs and stuff. Like that's pretty cool. I could do that. And so I think I skipped the last month of high school, last 2 weeks of high school, just to begin this like film program at it's called CDIS school. Made demo reel within like a year there. I kind of scrapped something together myself, and then I went to London. I wanted to work in film at the time. There's not a big like films visual effects scene in Vancouver, a lot of TV work, Stargate, that kind of shows. But in London, they were working on Harry Potter and stuff like that. So, 2004, I went to London and got a job at DNEG as a junior compositor, and I've been working in the industry nearly 20 years since then. So,
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for chatting with me. I love the show and love your work in it. So, I appreciate it, and best of luck.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.